Hey gang, welcome to the latest episode of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. Originally, I was planning on doing a collaboration on this theme, but my collaborator bailed, so you just have me for the next hour. Merchandise should be available in less than a week, so look for that, and the live stream virtual campfire is also on the way. Lots of cool things happening, but for now, sit back and enjoy some terrifying tales from the middle of nowhere. Let's get it on. The Men in the Woods by Eagle River D. I was in Juneau, Alaska once traveling on business. After work, I decided to drive north out of town, and I was stopping randomly at different beaches. I stopped at this one and was having a great time on the beach by myself, just watching the birds, fishing, and looking at the tidal pools. A truck pulled up in the parking lot above me, and I didn't think much of it. The first time. The truck spun around and left, heading north. I wandered further down the beach, and a few minutes later, the truck came back. It parked at the overlook for a bit, and this beach was probably 50 feet lower in elevation than the parking lot. There was just a bluff, and it just sat there on the bluff. Then it peeled out again and headed off towards the south. I was a bit creeped out, and about this time I started making my way back to the trail to go back to my car. Right about then, the truck came back. It parked with its headlights shining right towards me and just sat there. It was now getting to be dusk. Then it peeled out, but I heard it stop right where my car was parked. I heard the engine shut down on the truck, and right then every instinct in me said, hide. I left the beach and went straight into the woods and somewhat up a little hill. Juneau has big trees, and I found one that had been knocked down, and I laid down on the far side of it. I was wearing a bright blue jacket and knew even in the fading light I stuck out like a sore thumb. My cell phone had a poor connection, and I wasn't armed because I can't carry any weapons when I travel by airplane. I was scared spitless at this point. Then I heard slam, slam, and I knew that there were at least two people out there. They had waited a while, I guess, maybe to see if I was coming up the trail. And now they started down it, and one of the men appeared to have a long object, and I think it was a rifle, but in the fading light it may have been a bat or something else. He was calling out, "Hello? Where are you?" All of a sudden, I felt very much like I'd just stepped into the most dangerous game. I remained hidden, heart beating wildly. I waited until the men were well down onto the beach, and then began climbing the hill in the woods up to where I knew the parking lot was. I tried not to make any noise, but of course that was impossible. There were dried leaves and deadfalls all over the place. I was making a heck of a racket. But I guess they never heard me. I got up to my car, and the truck freaked me out. It was fully tinted, and there was no way to tell if anyone was still inside the vehicle. I started my car and tore out of there. I have hiked alone all my life and been in far more remote places than this, but never before or since have I had such a feeling that I was in grave danger. To this day, I don't feel I overreacted. I am sure that those men had something very bad in store for me had they caught me. Out in Idaho. I imagine one could make up a Bigfoot story if they wanted to, but I doubt one could make up the scenario that led to this encounter. During the early 90s, I wanted to live like Grizzly Adams, and I moved to a remote wilderness in northern Idaho. To give an idea of how remote an area this was, the Forest Service road just past our place was gated off to protect grizzly bears. Only a handful of people lived in this area, spread out over a dozen 24-acre properties. Everything else was just extreme wilderness. This was north of Sandpoint, Idaho. The night of my encounter, meeting Bigfoot was the last thing on my mind, and I must say I was confused by what I saw as well as being left utterly speechless. Although I had grown up in Northern California and was familiar with Bigfoot lore, I pretty much filed it away as a neat story, but not something to believe in. When you're broke and living on a mountain, there's not much to do except get together with neighbors and have a good time. Our lot was no different. I must add that during this time of my life, drinking was not big on my list, and this evening was no different. However, it was Halloween, and I had had some beer earlier in the evening between 5 and 8 or so. Please remember, I was weighing in at 240 pounds, and the actual sighting was well into the night, probably between 11 and 1 a.m. So anyway, my ex and I were at this Halloween party and had slipped into our normal silent argument routine. So, needless to say, we weren't talking. One of the neighbors had arrived with a tractor pulling a trailer loaded with straw in hopes of taking everyone on a hayride. Eventually, we left on it, and there were around 16 of us, evenly made up of adults and children of all ages, costumes and all. Upon leaving, I don't think we had a destination in mind, but someone eventually suggested we head to Bloom Lake, a small mountain lake with rough access that would require leaving the tractor at the logging road and then walking the remaining half-mile or so. As stated earlier, my ex and I were giving each other the silent treatment and found ourselves drifting to the back of the 2x2 line. Eventually, we'd allowed enough space to develop between us and the pack to lose sight of them as they went around bends in the trail. As we neared the lake, the trail forked in two directions, both leading to it. My ex and I were just close enough to see the backside of the last person headed down the trail to the right. As we came to the fork, I was closest to the center fork, while my ex was outside on the far right. Right as we approached the intersection, I focused on a being crouched down at the base of a tree where the trails came together. This animal stayed put while I tried to figure out what I was seeing. It felt like total slow motion. I had a visual on it, and I was staring right at it. However, the animal did not seem to be interested in eye contact. Just as we passed by and the animal was to my left behind me, I looked over my shoulder to see it rise silently next to the tree it had been crouching next to. I'm 6'3", and I would guess this being to be about 8 feet tall. Standing now, this animal did not want eye contact still, and kept us in its peripheral vision. I looked forward and could see the back of the last person ahead of us, and I wanted to yell out to everyone, but figured it was not the best thing to do. I doubt that I was close enough to touch it, but I am quite sure it could have reached me without taking a step. I thought that I should say something to the ex, but I was speechless. I looked over my shoulder again to see this animal take a huge, silent step out of the brush, and then take only 2 or 3 more up the trail we had come down before being out of sight. These steps were large, silent, and punctuated with his long arms swinging with his strides. I spent many years wondering how no one else saw this, and I never told anyone from that night, except the ex. I was familiar with forest wildlife and had viewed several species at length before this. I've always consoled myself by saying, I'm not sure what I saw, but I know what I didn't see, and it wasn't a bear, elk, a mountain lion, moose, or anything else I can think of. Even after my encounter, I still thought most of the TV shows out there were jokes, but now I think differently. This area of Bonner County, Idaho, is very close to the encounter told of in the Pack River area. It's also close to the Clark Fork area encounters, kind of between the two. I always wondered what Bigfoot thought about 16 people coming down the trail at this time of night, costumes and all. I mean, this area is remote. 16 people at any time must have been a shock. I lived in that area for around 6 years, and in that time I viewed large footprints in the snow, mud, and soft shoulder soil. I'd often visited another lake nearby, and one time, upon reaching the top of the trail, found a large scat pile and could smell the rankest odor. I felt like I was not alone and headed home immediately. And from time to time I would hear shrieks in the forest around my cabin, but never could figure out what it was. At this time I was usually very angry, dealing with my ex, and these things would just get filed away as something to worry about later. I had actually forgotten most of these until now. Ghost Cabin in the Woods by David S. This ghost experience which I'm writing about took place many years ago when I was much younger. Somewhere around 11 years old. Obviously I'm now older, but I have some memories which will never leave me. Most of them took place when I lived with my grandparents in a fairly small town in the country. We lived in an area surrounded by woods in an old but comfortable house. During these years I was used to taking walks in the woods, and I was very interested in nature, could sit for hours by the lake staring up at the sky and the towering trees. I grew very familiar with the woods and walked the same trails each day, knowing where each direction led. However, one particular day, while walking in my usual path, I became lost while walking back home. I couldn't recognize the surrounding trees, and I knew I had never walked in this area before. Puzzled, I thought that I had taken a wrong step somewhere. Daydreaming, I must have lost track of time and stumbled upon an old undiscovered path. As I tried to find my way, it became dark, and the area grew less and less familiar. Soon I became scared and quickened my pace, and not minutes had passed until I came upon an old cabin. This cabin was withered and seemed to blend in with the surrounding area. I felt a distinct chill as I walked closer, and my fear only increased. In the dark, I called out to see if anyone was home and got no response. Walking into the house, my footsteps creaked, and I brushed away cobwebs from around me. I walked into a small room which had a bed, and it seemed as if no one had slept there for years. I decided to stay in this room where I could sleep until the morning, so I closed the door, knowing that this would not make me feel any safer. The distinct feeling of someone watching was felt everywhere in this little house, but it grew even stronger in the bedroom. I closed my eyes and drifted into a light sleep. When I heard the sound of a door slamming, I could also feel a presence walking through the house. I tried to call out to see who it was, but was too scared to make a sound. When the sound stopped, I could feel a ghostly presence standing before the door of the bedroom, and suddenly the hair on the back of my neck stood up as I decided to try and escape. When the door opened, I could not breathe as I witnessed a tall figure which uttered a horrible-sounding laughter. This lasted only a minute, and the being then vanished into the wall, and I went to the door in order to leave this stupid house. As I ran to the front door, I could feel this presence moving towards me, making a very rapid, low breathing sound. Before I could catch my breath, I blacked out, collapsing to the floor. As I awoke, I found myself in the woods in a familiar area. I could remember only until the moment where I had gone unconscious, and I felt as frightened as I had at that moment. Looking in each direction, I did not see any trace of the cabin or any change in the surroundings. I was in the place I had been walking through on my way home, and I realized that not even an hour had passed. As I arrived home, I was greeted by my grandparents, which I had feared would be looking for me. And when I told them about this strange walk I had taken, and about the old cabin, they looked at each other with a glance and then fell silent. They then told me I had been dreaming, and that I hadn't been gone for more than a few hours. They're no longer with us, but they never spoke about it after that day, and I always thought they might have been keeping something from me. Was it a ghost that I had seen? Is it even possible for an entire cabin to appear, as if it were a ghost? Firepower Saved the Day by Bon Scott 420. This story took place back in the late 1990s. My brother and some friends used to go camping and fishing and shooting at a piece of land owned by a friend's family. It was out in the middle of nowhere and butted up against some state preserves, with the only little town about 5 miles away. To get to where we would camp, you left a 2-lane country route, took a paved road that eventually turned into a dirt road, and then turned into an even more dirt road, if that makes sense. There were a few hunting cabins here and there, and even a couple of permanent residents way out, but for the most part it was just sprawling fields and forest. This time we went out there, it was my brother, who I'll call R, our friend T, and another friend G. We had stocked up on food and drinks and were planning on staying there for a long weekend, Thursday to Sunday in late August. We arrived and set up our campsite in a little clearing in some woods far away from the dirt road that led us there. Where we were, if you were driving by to the preserve or just passing through, you'd never even knew we were out there. This was always a great time of guys just being guys, staying up late around a campfire, getting up and fishing and swimming, target and pigeon shooting, and hiking around the area to explore what was out there. All right, before the nuts come out of the woodwork, I'm talking about clay target pigeons, not real ones. We had brought along quite an arsenal, and usually did, as this was the one time every year we got together and wanted to show one another anything new we had purchased or otherwise obtained. One year G brought an old musket, and other years someone had brought a new handgun for everyone to try. And of course there was always the new fishing tackle that would really catch the fish. Yeah, right. This time out I had brought my AKM, my brother had his Colt AR-15, T had brought a Ruger of which I can't remember what model, and there were other shotguns and pistols for everyone to shoot. I only mention the rifles specifically as they play a part in this story. And now, before everyone brings out the anti-gun stuff, let me just say that none of us have these weapons anymore, and that I totally understand why people don't want others having access to them. I came to realize that I only shot mine on occasions like this, and my money was better invested in my collection of competition shotguns. The tragedies happening in our country and around the world right now are horrific, and while I am NRA, I may be the only one who thinks there should be stiffer regulations for owning these weapons. Anyway, back to the story. So there we were, having fun in the sun, and after shooting at some paper targets, we took a swim in the pond and then started to think about dinner as it was in the afternoon. I volunteered to cook and got to work setting up the fire to make some steak and potatoes, and the other guys went off to hike around the land and check out some spots we rarely went to. So, alone, I cracked a beer and waited to get a decent bed of coals going. I was sitting in a chair reading a Stephen King book when I got that creepy feeling someone was watching me. I looked around and saw nothing and went back to reading. But that feeling came again, and then I heard a twig snap behind me, and just as I was unholstering my Smith & Wesson 9mm, I turned around and heard a voice call out. It was just Pete, a guy who lived out here not too far from our campsite. I sighed a sigh of relief and stood up to greet him and offered him a beer. Pete was a little weird, but a good enough guy. He just liked living far away from everything after his wife passed away a few years earlier. He had heard a shooting and wanted to come over and say hi. After a bit, we heard the guys coming back, and there was a lively discussion with Pete about what had been going on out here and so on. We invited Pete to stay for dinner and into the night as we kept talking and putting back the beers. Around midnight, we decided to turn in and head for our tents, and sleep was easy, but I woke up to more twigs breaking softly and soft footsteps. Then there was the snuffling, and I whispered to T, whose tent was right next to mine. Hey, hear that? Yep, just coyotes checking us out. Don't sweat it, he said. This was usual for out here, but beyond that I heard something else I didn't mention. Heavier footsteps, and I swear whispering, and maybe a whistle? I knew there was a whistle, and I knew it wasn't any bird or animal, but I just rolled over to feel my shotgun just in case. Eventually the sounds died down and I went back to sleep. The next morning I got up to find my brother messing with the Coleman propane stove, and I mentioned the sounds to him. He hadn't heard anything, and he decided to run back into the little town to get a couple more propane canisters, as we used one in the lantern the night before, and another one we brought was empty. He took off, and G&T got up, and we went to take a swim and a shower at a pond. I went when they got back, and my brother finally showed up and made breakfast. It was another fun day of just being outside, and G surprised us with his gift to the trip, a box of tracer rounds. I had never shot them, and thought that would be cool to do right at dusk before it would be illegal to shoot in the dark. Fast forward to that evening, and while we were getting another fire stoked for a round of grilled chicken, we shot a few of those rounds of tracers at some targets, and it was pretty cool to see the colored lines from the shots zoom through the dusk. More beer flowed that night, and just as the fire was dying down, we heard more twigs snapping off in the woods near us. Now, we weren't paranoid, but we were familiar with the sounds out here, and we knew this wasn't deer, and we could hear the coyotes yipping far away as they made their rounds. G spoke up and said, "Did you guys hear a whistle?" None of us had, and we shook our heads. But then we did hear another one. And then another. They were all coming from different spaces around us, mostly behind us, coming from the direction of the pond. We were all dead silent as we heard more movement, and then a voice fairly distant call out, "Yoo-hoo, boys! Can we come over to play?" My brother looked at me dead in the eyes, and then at G and T. There was laughter and more sounds of movement. Then 3 more whistles. There were 3 people out there moving towards us, signaling one another with the whistling as to where they were. T pointed in 3 different directions as to where he thought they were standing or moving, and my brother nodded. Whistles came again, and another voice said, "It's awfully quiet over there. What's the matter, boys?" And then a freaky laugh rang out. T spoke up. "You're on private property and you're not welcome here. Leave." Silence. Then more movement.
"That's not very hospitable of you boys," said a voice. "We're all nice guys, ain't that right?"
More laughter. They were getting closer, but were still out of the light of our lantern and fire. My brother pointed at our rifle bags and then at our targets that were off to the left of where these people were coming from. I knew what he meant, and so did T. G spoke up. "Seriously, this isn't cool. You're trespassing. Turn around and leave now." More silence.
"How about a beer before you hand over your shit?" said the voice.
Now the sounds of steps were much closer. And by this time we had all armed ourselves with our rifles, and I should point out that all of them had 30-round magazines loaded. My brother pointed at our targets once again and whispered, "Shoot below them into the ground and go full pack. That'll scare them off." We were already a little spread out and raised our rifles quietly, and my brother counted down from 3, and we let the lead fly. 120 rounds just blasting away at tree stumps and the ground. I had forgotten I had left tracer rounds in my magazine, and that made the firepower all that more dramatic. It sounded like a war zone, and for nearly 20 seconds or so the deafening sound of semi-automatic fire filled the night. We never got the chance to hear whoever it was running away, but when the echoes died down, all was silent in the woods. We all remained quiet with the buzzing in our ears, and we didn't have time to put on our ear protection. I fished some beers out of the cooler, and after a bit we heard someone coming from the direction of our vehicles. It was Pete, wondering what the fuck was going on. T told them what had happened and why we had done what we did. He shook his head and wondered aloud who was out there, and whoever it was, they were not up to continuing to fuck with us that night, I can guarantee you. We all stayed up around the fire, eating and drinking more beer, listening for a return of whoever was out there, but they were long gone. When first light came, we fanned out into the forest in the direction of where we heard the voices and searched around us for clues as to who it was. G found a very large Bowie knife that he actually kept and still has, and my brother found the coup de grace, a pair of soiled pants. Someone, in their haste to run away, had shit their drawers last night. We all voted on staying the rest of the weekend, and I went into town to the little store to get some more beer and water. While I was in there, the shopkeeper Ray, who we'd known for years, asked if our friends had found us. "What friends?" I asked. "Oh, the 4 guys that came in the other day asking where you were camping. Said they missed your meetup back in town and couldn't remember where you were staying. The 4 guys with the long hair." I looked at Ray and said, "Those weren't our friends, Ray." I then asked him if he had told them where we were. He put his head down and nodded. Said, "Yeah, I'm sorry." His face was white, and he kept apologizing, but I told him to forget it. When I got back to the camp, I relayed the info to the guys, and everyone just shook their heads. The rest of the weekend was quiet, and we had a good time, but we kept going over and over what had happened and wondering who those guys were, how they knew we were out there, and what they were up to. Our group doesn't really get together that much anymore. Life got in the way, and families took priority over hangouts in the woods. My brother and I still shoot competitively, and I do see him more often than anybody else. I heard Pete passed away last summer, and I've only been out to our camping spot a couple of times since that last trip. What we did was dangerous that night, but I am convinced that was the best way to scare off someone who clearly had bad intentions. I had been tracked by Eye of the Taiga. When I was a kid in Colorado, I spent a lot of time cross-country skiing in the mountains, often alone. One beautiful winter afternoon, I drove to a trailhead of a favorite place and began skiing up the old mining road, which wound and rolled its way gently uphill into a remote wilderness area. At that elevation, the forest was a mixture of Douglas firs, lodgepole, and alpine firs, which transitioned to alpine firs, bristlecone pines, then open alpine tundra at the higher elevations towards which I was headed. The first several miles of the trail were fairly well forested, and sight distance on both sides of the trail was limited. I was setting fresh tracks in about 4 inches of new snow, and there was no sign of another human for many miles. After skiing less than a mile, I began to get the creepy feeling that I was being watched. I started looking around as I skied, and looking over my shoulders constantly. I occasionally stopped abruptly and looked back, but I never saw anything but sparkling snow and pristine forest. I continued to ski, but couldn't shake that creepy feeling that I was not alone and was still being watched. After a couple of miles more, I couldn't take it anymore. I executed a 180-degree kick turn and headed back in my tracks. I had not gone more than 40 feet when I came to big cat tracks in my ski tracks. The cat had seconds before diverted into the trees just to my left. I set a new record time for the return trip to the car, and although I continued to check over my shoulder occasionally, I never saw anything. The cat had picked me up about 30 yards from the car and had been right on my tail for 3 miles. Not Alone in the Woods, submitted by Hunter Snowman. I've been hunting for a long time, since I was a kid with my father, my uncles, and my friends. Going to Uncle Roy's cabin was a big deal when I was in my teens. It meant a guy's weekend, sometimes skipping school for an opener. Good food, and maybe a beer or two, as my dad believed in letting me experience things early so I would make better choices later on in life. Uncle Roy's cabin was up in northern Wisconsin, and it was a great place with 2 rooms of bunks and a huge great room with a kitchen, fireplace, comfy old chairs. It was a home away from home for sure. It stayed in our family after Uncle Roy died back in 1998, and we still use it. But there was one trip with my cousin and best friend that almost made up our minds to never go back. It was early fall, and we went up for a weekend to try our luck on the 60-plus acres, and the drive was about an hour from Appleton, where we lived. We were all a couple of years out of college, and it was Travis, me, and my cousin George. We left mid-afternoon and got there before 5, and it was already dark. We got our gear inside and turned on the propane, got a fire going, and figured we'd just kick back with a couple of beers, have some chili, and then hit the sack early before we went out in the morning. It was gun season for deer, and we were all hoping to bag at least one. The next morning was crisp, and we ate some oatmeal, took some power bars, and then suited up and started the walks out to the tree stands out on the property. I think a lot of people have a notion that hunting is the most exciting thing in the world, and it can be thrilling, but a lot of the time it's just sitting on your ass waiting. I had brought a portable radio with headphones that I was playing softly, and for some reason it was Coast to Coast with Art Bell. If you don't know what that show is, it's a talk show that talks about ghosts and Bigfoot and stuff like that. It was about 6 a.m. and it was the only thing I could get in reception, so it kind of gave a spooky air to the whole weekend, that's for sure. Anyway, things were pretty quiet for a couple of hours, and the sun was now up higher in the sky, and I was going to give it a couple of more and then take a break and maybe come back out later. After about a half hour, the show had some guy on talking about demons and stuff, and it was really freaking me out. I only had one earpiece in so I could monitor what was going on around me, and then I heard the sound of leaves crunching. I slowly turned a bit to scan around the area and see if I was about to have a little honey coming my way. But I saw it was Travis holding his shotgun in the crook of his arm, and his other hand looked bloody. I got down from my stand and asked him what was up. He had a weird tale. Travis had heard a noise behind him, like something crashing through the brush, and then he heard something like a muffled yell. Thinking it was someone hurt, and maybe one of us, he got down and went in the direction of where he heard the sounds. Seeing some branches swaying back and forth, he called out and walked towards a part of the forest edge that was stacked with trees. He got to the edge, called out again, and then popped down a little path that led deeper into the forest. As he walked between 2 trees, a thick branch came whipping towards him and cracked him square on the hand, and he dropped his shotgun. He said he heard a laugh and steps running away through the forest before he got over the shock and saw his hand was really banged up. I took a peek at it, and it was really swollen. He could move it, so we didn't think it was broken, but he certainly needed to get some ice on it pronto. We tried to get a message to George, but our signal out here was weak on our cell phones, so I figured he'd just head back to the cabin on his own, and we started walking back to it. When we got there, I got some ice, and Travis put it in a towel and wrapped his hand, and we kept talking about what had happened. He kept saying it was like some crank had set him up, and it wasn't normal to have a booby trap out in the middle of nowhere on posted land like that. It was about another hour when we heard footsteps coming towards the cabin on the gravel, and in came Georgie with a rapidly bruising eye and scratches on his forehead. We immediately asked what the heck had happened to him, and he said something similar to what Travis had said. He'd heard a strange sound in the woods, and when he went to check it out, his foot snagged on something, and the next thing he knew, a thick branch swung down onto the trail and caught him in the temple and face. He wasn't bleeding badly, but I got him some ice too. I said out loud that we should talk to the authorities, as it seemed like someone who was not supposed to be out there was making little traps for us to come across. I volunteered to go the next morning, and I said we should lay low for the rest of the night. At about 2 a.m, we started to hear thumping on the roof, and soon figured out someone was throwing rocks at the cabin. Nothing at the windows, just up on the roof. Everyone was awake at this point, and I told Travis to get his shotgun and go to the back door. I would go to the front door, and on the count of 3, we would open the doors and fire off 2 shells into the air to scare away anyone who was out there. We got ready, and on 3, blam, 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 4 shots almost in perfect unison. Then everything was quiet. We stayed up a bit longer, but nothing happened, so we finally fell back to sleep. I got up early and made the journey to the nearest town where there was a substation and told the deputy everything that had been going on. He said he had a little time to follow me out to our place and have a look around with us. When we made our way up the driveway to the cabin, I noticed that on the outside wall someone had written the words "Go away" in charcoal. The deputy asked if I knew what that was about, and I hadn't even noticed it before. I brought him inside, introduced George and Travis, and we all had a cup of coffee before we set out for our stands and some of the trails we frequently went down while we were hunting. It was an interesting and terrifying walk, as not only the deputy, but all 3 of us found some pretty creepy things out there. On one thin path between trees and a drop-off of about 15 feet down to a creek, the deputy noticed that someone had set up another trip line close to the ground that could have resulted in a dangerous fall for someone. Near the tree stand George was in, there was something really disturbing. This stand didn't have a ladder, and you used foot pegs and a belt to get up into it. It stayed there all year long. Usually, anyone who was using this stand would just jump down as it was only about 8 or 10 feet up. Good thing George hadn't, because someone had dug a pit about 3 feet deep and put sharpened sticks at the bottom of it, covered it up with light branches and a thin layer of sod. You could stand on it, but a jump down would have surely meant impalement. The deputy was taking pictures of everything and also taking notes in his little pad. There were more booby traps all around the land, at least the portion we frequented. The craziest one? Near a stand my dad used a lot. At the base, there were a number of small holes. In the holes pointed upward were shotgun shells, slugs. On each shell was glued a BB on the primer, and there was a flat stone underneath each one. In essence, if someone stepped on one hard enough or jumped down from the stand, yeah, think about that. Boom. We went back to the cabin, and the deputy radioed for more help, and for the rest of the weekend there were stadies and deputies going all over the land to see what else might be out there. They finally came across a tent in a growth of trees. Inside was a mishmash of dirty clothes, empty food cans and wrappers, a handwritten notebook about how to make traps and bombs, as well as some glass jars that the deputy later proved to be improvised bombs that had to be destroyed by a bomb expert. There were also a bunch of handmade signs that said things like, "Meat is murder," and "How do you like being hunted?" and "Get out or else." Some of these were hanging from trees in our places on the land, and we had not noticed them. They never found anyone, and this is the only time something like this happened out there. The deputies thought it must have been an earth lover that got a little misguided. Yeah, I guess that's one way to put it. We've been back lots of times, and we've all gotten our share of deer and turkey and boar, but thankfully whoever was out there doing all that stuff to scare us off never came back. If that guy by chance hears this, dude, there are other ways to talk to us about your views that don't involve trying to kill us. I'm still shaking my head over that weekend. My Time in Dudleytown by Stacy. Last year, me and my boyfriend went to Dudleytown in mid-November. If you don't know what Dudleytown is, it's a settlement that was founded in the mid-1700s and was abandoned in the early 1800s in Connecticut. No one knows why it was abandoned. We entered through the dark entry road, which didn't have a street sign, but we were able to figure it out through directions, pictures, and a good hunch. We noticed the sign, but of course ignored it anyway. As soon as we left the car, our phones lost service, and we walked until we came across what looked like stone basements. I tried using my phone the entire walk, and sometimes it would ring 2 or 3 times, but then it would go into a strange static. I thought nothing of it, though. We were in the middle of the woods. The only thing that we saw that was scary was a white-tailed deer. Birds were chirping. It seemed like any other hike in the woods, and we couldn't leave well enough alone, though. We both took a rock from as close to the foundations as we would get. A little disappointed, we made our way back to the car with our rocks, and once we actually sat in the car, service returned to our phones. We drove away with our rocks in tow, and after leaving Cornwall Center, we witnessed what I thought was a funny but strange accident involving vehicles in front of us, which could have easily included myself had I not been paying attention. I dropped my friend off at his home, and he forgot his rock in my back seat. I put my rock on my front porch and then went in to watch some TV. I tried to turn down my volume via remote, but that wouldn't work. I pounded on the keys a few times, and suddenly the volume started lowering, but I wasn't touching the remote. It was strange because the volume decreased in single increments. 10, 9, 8, 7, down to mute. The problem with that is either manually or by remote, the volume only ever changed in increments of 2. I was freaked out enough that the next day I threw the rock on my porch in the woods and forgot about it. It was easy to forget, too, seeing as though my car was breaking down daily, weekly if I was lucky. I had other things on my mind. After clearing out my car and preparing it for yet another trip to the shop, I found my boyfriend's rock. I gave it back to my boyfriend and he put it under his bed, and later that night we were fooling around taking pictures, and almost all of them orbs could be seen, and unexplained smoke. One in particular, half of my face is covered in a haze. This is the point where I started to see a relation between odd things happening and these rocks that we took. Strange things seemed to follow them, and I am by no means a superstitious person, and frankly don't believe the myths surrounding Dudleytown. Much of the reason why I took the rocks to maybe challenge whatever all the hype was about. We put the remaining rock in the car the next day with intentions to dispose of it. Again, it was forgotten for a few days, but remembered once my car started acting up again. We were leaving a friend's place when we finally decided to toss it and left it in the parking lot in a grassy area in front of her apartment. Less than 2 weeks later, her house was raided and she was in jail. Of course, had they been law-abiding citizens, a raid would have never taken place. It just seemed ironic that it happened so soon after we left that rock in front of it. They had been living there for over a year with no problems. And listen, I'm not saying that anything that happened in that month was paranormal, supernatural, or whatever else. What I am saying is that enough strange, uncanny things took place that I almost began to fear a rock. I noticed a distinct pattern between where they were placed and negative things that took place around them. My fears almost seemed too confirmed since discarding the rocks last year. I haven't had any problems since, no hazy photos, and no self-adjusting volume on my TV. Of course, there were smaller coincidences that are forgotten or not worth mentioning, but all in all, both of our families think we meddled with something we shouldn't have, and honestly, I do too. Sometimes there are just too many coincidences for it to be a coincidence. Village in the Middle of Nowhere. Submitted by Dark Razor Scratch. A few years back, I was really into off-roading in my D90 and took my rig all over the place in Pennsylvania, up into New England, over to West Virginia, and so on. I did a lot of the official parks like Roush Creek, Paragon before it closed, Chaos Park, and tons of great places, people, and times. A few friends and I usually all went together with our different vehicles, Jeeps, Dodges, and some homemade rigs too. Weekends were full of technical trails and climbs, breakdowns, and a whole shitload of fun. None of the guys I went with were into the whole mudding thing, and I'm not knocking that, but just blasting through mud holes wasn't really our thing. One weekend we had planned fell through, and I still wanted to go do something, so I talked to my buddy Ken to see if he'd be up for at least an afternoon of off-road fun, and he was down. We planned on hitting up Chaos, leave early in the morning, have some fun, and then be back late that night. I packed a bunch of sandwiches, soda, and chips into the cooler, hit up a local coffee shop for some Joe, and then picked up Ken. It was still super early in the AM, and we were having a great time just talking and drinking our coffee, planning out the day's events. So, we got to the park, hooked up with some other guys we'd met there before, and after a while of bullshitting and catching up, we spent the day playing in the woods and rocks and having a freaking blast. Late in the afternoon, we had a couple of beers and then stuck around talking shop. Before we knew it, it was dark and we needed to hit the road. One of the guys told me and Ken about a shortcut that should have gotten us home through this forest and saved us some time on the way home. Like total morons, we gave it a shot. Most of it was turn left at the stump you'll see on the right shit, and we scribbled that down on a piece of paper. So, off we went, looking for these weird landmarks, and after a while we're going down what basically were fire roads, when we got into what I thought was Virginia. The GPS was sketching out, and these directions were seriously shitty. Suddenly, we saw some lights up ahead, and we found ourselves driving into what looked like a settlement of some sort. There were trailers on cut lawns lining this fire road. Some had attached garages and carports, but all of them had lots of Confederate flags and such. Here and there, people were outside by fire pits, and with the windows down, the loudest sound was the crunching of my tires on the gravel. As we made our way through, people were coming out of their buildings and staring at us, and as we were getting to the end of this strip of trailers, about 7 big dudes stepped out onto the road blocking my D90. Ken looked at me and said, "What the fuck is this, man?" I told him to be cool as one of the guys started to walk over to my window. Ken looked back and hissed, "They're blocking the back too, man." I kept a smile on my face, and my hand left the gear shift and rested on my hip. That's where my holstered P30L sat. I kept my other arm resting on the window and watched as the guy moved towards me. He was wearing a sleeveless flannel shirt with a jean vest, and he had long hair and a big beard. He got up to my door and peered inside. "Evening," I said. He just looked at me and nodded and sort of mumbled nothing. "Is everything okay? We're just trying to get back to a highway and get home."
"Where'd you come from?"
he asked. I could smell beer and cigarettes on his breath. I told him we had been at Chaos Park, and that we were following bad directions home with a laugh.
"What do you mean it's bad out here?"
he asked. Oh shit, I thought. We're going to do the dick dance. Ken coughed, and I looked over to see another guy standing by his door. I said I simply meant the directions were screwy, and I didn't think we were on the right road.
"Pretty fancy truck you have here. Cost a lot?"
I laughed a little and said, "Actually, I bought it used in Florida and fixed it up myself. It's a Land Rover Defender 90.
"I can read, boy,"
he said flatly. Second time I thought, oh shit. I looked at Ken, then looked at the guys standing on the road, and I couldn't help but notice 2 of them had rifles in their arms.
"Pretty expensive?"
he asked again. I told him how much I paid for it, and that the labor was more than the basic cost of it.
"How about you letting me take a little test drive?"
I smiled a thin smile and said, "I'm afraid my insurance doesn't cover that, my friend."
"I ain't your friend, he
said.
"Come on out of there, both of you."
I looked at Ken, and then back at him. Then I looked at the guys in the road, and to this day, I can't believe what I did. Let me say this, I am not a fighting type of guy. I'm more of a quiet nerd than anything else, but I do hunt and shoot. I am an outdoors kind of guy, but I am the first guy to try to make peace with anybody in a bad situation. I stalled for a minute as he leaned right into the door and said,
"Get out. Now."
In a flash, I slammed my hand down on his arm that was now resting on the door window frame, and then ripped out the P30 and pointed it at his face. I was literally shaking about what I was doing, and even now as I write this, the hair on my arms is raising up. His eyes got wide, and I said, "This ends right now. Start walking with me. Ken, shift." I didn't take my eyes off the guy, but could feel Ken staring at me when he said, "What?" "Shift the fucking truck, Ken," I said, and lightly stepped on the gas, let up on the clutch, and we slowly started rolling forward. Slow enough for this guy to walk with his one arm stuck under mine, looking into the barrel of my pistol. He didn't say anything. He was just breathing hard and slowly walking along with me. "Ken, tell those motherfuckers to back off and keep their rifles pointed down." He said, "What?" Yeah. And then he yelled that out the window at them. They backed up and off the thin road. The dude was still staring at me and my pistol when I got to the edge of the clearing and slowed the D90. I let go of the guy's arm and said, "Sorry about that. We don't want any trouble." He just stared blankly and didn't say anything. I hit it and we lurched forward and took off into the darkness at a high rate of speed on that fire road. And that was it. No shots fired, no one racing after us, nothing like that. It felt like a dream as we plowed on until we came to a paved road, and I didn't even think to look at the directions or check my GPS. I just turned right and got the fuck out of there as fast as I could. Ken finally spoke up and said, "What the fuck do you think that was all about?" I shook my head, and he said we should probably tell somebody about that weird little colony, and I thought about it for a minute. "Brother, the local gendarmes are probably related to those guys or know all about them. Let's just get home." Turns out, overall, it wasn't a bad shortcut as we did get home pretty quickly, but I really wish the guys at the park had warned us about that place. The next day I looked on a map for what I thought was the closest town and called a state police barracks, but nobody answered the phone. I left a message about the strangeness of the night before, but I never heard back from anyone. We laugh about it now, but that night was the first and last time I ever pointed my P30 at anyone, and I still can't believe I did that. I guess when push comes to shove, we're all capable of doing things we don't think we are. Scarface by you-know-who. When I was a kid, I went to this church camp about an hour and a half from my hometown. It was mostly kids from my church, but occasionally other kids from different places showed up too. It was a cool place, and outside of the Bible jazz we had to go through each day, there was a ton of stuff to do. There were crafts, sports, hiking, this really cool clay embankment you could make water slides out of and then slide into a creek, and every night we played stuff like Capture the Flag. You can check the place out. It's still open. It's called Camp Duffield. So, as I got older, I still went, but at that time I was a counselor in training, and later I was the athletic director. This story happened when I was a CIT, and it was counselors' night out. That meant the older counselors in the cabins either hung out in the food hall relaxing or playing cards or whatever, or they actually left camp for a meal at a nearby restaurant a few miles away. My counselor didn't want to leave our cabin, so my friend Tom, who was a CIT in another cabin, asked me to come over to his with his campers and tell them some stories. His counselor was going for the night out. I gladly did and thought I would tell the tale of Scarface. It had been told to just about every kid who ever went to that camp, and it was a sorry tale. As far as I know, there was a little truth to it, but of course, as time goes by, things got souped up for theatrical effect. Each cabin had about 10 sets of bunk beds on either side of one big room, and they each had a front and back door. It was the same for the guys and the girls, but they were separated by a larger building. The back door to the boys' cabins led almost directly down into a deep canyon with a creek at the bottom. So I went over to Tom's cabin, turned out the lights, grabbed a flashlight, and began the tale. The true part of the story is there was a guy who lived not too far from the camp that had been in a shop accident while he was working on a vehicle. He became terribly disfigured, sad but true. He still worked at the shop, but only at night, and no one really saw him during the day as his face was pretty mangled up and he was embarrassed about how he looked. He eventually turned to living in a shack out in the woods near the edge of the camp. Well, the loneliness and anger and rage took over, and the guy began stalking people at the camp at all hours of the day. Sometimes kids would be at the far edge of the camp at a lean-to called the Outpost, and they would see a figure in overalls with what looked like a mask just standing at the edge of the field watching over them. Other times, kids would be swimming in the pond and hanging out on a raft and look up to see the same guy crouched down at the edge of the water staring at them. He wasn't wearing a mask. That was his real face. Creepier encounters included kids being waylaid on their way back from the bathrooms in the dark of night to see a figure standing just outside the floodlights near the cabins. On more than one occasion, Scarface was seen up close by a camper as he peered in through the cabin windows and would sometimes try to open the locked doors as most of the campers slept, while others that were awake heard his footsteps and breathing. So I'm telling the campers all of these stories in the dark with just a little flashlight, and they were all riveted. Even the kids who had heard these stories or knew someone who had seen Scarface were getting scared. I picked up the story. See, after a while, old Scarface wasn't satisfied with just looking and scaring campers, I said. Soon his anger and sadness and frustration had built up so much that he resented the happiness of everyone, especially people at a Christian summer camp so close to his shack. All the campers were looking at me now. He grew bolder and bolder and would actually walk into the shower areas in broad daylight as kids and counselors were cleaning up, clad in his dirty overalls, mangled face, and now he took to carrying around this big hatchet. The tension in the room was growing, and there was a thump from outside, and I looked up in full attention. One of the kids spoke up. "What was that?" "Probably just Mr. Alessi coming back from the night out," I said. "Hey, let's scare him when he comes in." All the kids agreed, and we waited for the front door to open. But that didn't happen. Instead, the back door was thrown open, and I spun with my light to catch a man in overalls, holding a hatchet bursting through, and he was wearing a half-shattered goalie mask like Jason Voorhees. The campers screamed, and one, sadly, pissed his jammies right that second as the man rushed into the room. Score one for me and my fellow CIT, Tom, who had slid out of the cabin while I was telling my tale. We had planned the whole thing, and it was a triumphant success, except for Scott peeing himself and everyone being terrified for the rest of the week. Tom and I got a stern talking to by the head campmaster, but everyone, even the campers, did get a kick out of it, and they still talk about it to this day. Uncle Josh note. That was me and my childhood friends Tom and Scott. Tom was the older brother of one of my closest friends, and we all grew up 2 houses from one another in the same neighborhood. Scott was a year younger than me, but he also grew up with me in the church of my youth, but he was from a town over. Sadly, Scott was killed in 1997 in a car accident while on leave from his military duty from the Army. He was only 22. Tom took his own life in 2010. He was just 40 years old. Rest in peace, fellas. Thanks for listening, gang. Please like, share, and subscribe if you haven't, and I'd also love to see your comments. I respond to them all. Follow me on social media, all the links are in the description, and if you feel so inclined, help keep this channel running ad-free by throwing me a tip at my Patreon page. If you have a scary story you would like to share, send it to unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. I read each and every one. Everyone, be excellent to each other, and until next time, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.